Well, this is a wonderful opportunity. I feel really excited about to launch a podcasting site and be able to share some of the thoughts I've shared all over the world to entrepreneurs and small business owners. I'm certainly hopeful that those of you listening now can gain some value from some of the insights I've been able to learn from over the years. I like to think of myself as having enough scar tissue to be able to share something of some worth. And I just wanted to take some time and share with you kind of how we arrived and at this idea of corporate soul, which is so important to me and I think central to the essence of what will be all of the podcasting that we'll be doing here on this site. I grew up in a family where vocabulary words were always bantered about. My dad, in fact, one of these podcasts, I'll bring it in and show it to you guys. My dad had a box full of vocabulary cards that he would keep in his glove box in his car. And this is probably the equivalent of 1970s texting and driving. But he would take these cards out. He had a long drive from White Plains, New York into Connecticut. And he would take these cards out and just take a handful and kind of quiz himself on the way home from work in an attempt to improve his vocabulary. And, it was funny, when I would get in the car as a young boy, he'd always say, try to stump me. And so I would grab these cards out of the glove box. And, I look back on it now, he's pretty smart. He knew that he was going to engender a love of language and of words in me at the same time as he was testing himself. It kind of became this joke, like if I could beat Dad, if I could actually stump my dad on a vocabulary word. My dad, Tyler Norton, his influence in my life really can't be overstated. He's just been a massive influence, as has been my mother, Bonnie. Professionally speaking, I learned a lot from my dad, and he's kind of the one where I learned this love of language and vocabulary words. Dad would quiz me in the car, and I think my love of language and words came from that. But I tell you that because I start with this question of where does the word corporate come from, corporation? And if you think about it, the etymological derivative of the word corporate or corporation comes from the word corporeal. And even in Spanish, I speak Spanish, cuerpo, this concept of a body. And over the years, as I've worked for different corporations, I had one particular experience where a gentleman asked this question that has just kind of stuck with me for a very, very long time. And the question was, if a corporation is a body, corporeal, a corporation comes from the notion of a body, then can it have a soul? And I found myself saying, what an interesting question. And it's funny, I've taught this now for a long time, more than 10 years in various settings across the globe. In fact, in some of the settings where I've shared this notion of corporate soul or ethos, as I'll get into, I've asked people and said, so if a corporation is a body, can it have a soul? And you might find it interesting. People actually always say yes. In fact, it's almost unanimous. It's very loudly. They'll say, yes, a corporation can and should have a soul. The next question I pose is, do most corporations have a soul? And as you might expect, these people then come back and say, no, the answer is most companies or corporations don't have a soul. So most of them believe they can have a soul. In fact, they're quick to say that almost unanimously that they can have a soul. But they're almost equal in their unanimous response to the notion that most corporations don't have a soul. I think it begs a really interesting question, right? Which is, why is it that if everyone believes that they can have a soul, and most people believe, yeah, a company should have a soul, it certainly would serve it well, why don't they have a soul? And we can sit here and kind of unpack that a great deal. It's interesting, Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great, recently met with a dear friend of mine, Clayton Mask, who is the co-founder and CEO of Infusionsoft. And Clayton told me that as they went to meet with Jim Collins, here's one of the world's top consultants for businesses, certainly understands why some businesses have durable, enduring success. And they were really at a unique stage. They'd been funded heavily on the VC side. They were growing quickly. had deployed that capital in service of all sorts of enterprise value growth. And they were really aiming and looking towards a potential public offering down the road. And Jim Collins posed this question and said, how many of you that were here at the beginning, founding leaders, founders themselves, intended to stay involved with the company? And I remember Clay telling me that they went back to, I think, a hotel room or wherever they were staying when they were there visiting with Jim. And they stayed up most of the night, really leaning into this question of how long do we intend to stay? As you know, an organization that goes public, they have a capital event, there's opportunity to rethink, there's opportunity to take money off the table and kind of revisit your next steps in life, which a lot of them had thought through. But in order to go from good to great, he also wrote a book called Built to Last. Those organizations that seemed to have some enduring success, something durable and long-standing, it seemed like he was drawing the connection between this notion of the soul, and that soul had some reference back to why it was started in the first place. What was the original vision and intent of that? And so I think corporate soul on the whole has a lot to do with some of the founding essence, the impetus, the motivation as to why it is that we started this in the first place. Those of you that are watching that are entrepreneurial, that are setting out to do and launch something, I think sometimes when we reduce our definition of success or impact to just the financial imperatives associated with something, or even the financial outcomes, quick gains or early outcomes as it relates to capital events, probably those things end up kind of becoming the dominant objective. And when that happens, I think it suppresses this concept or notion of corporate soul. I remember being in Romania asking this question and watching the response of the people there in that meeting. It was a large group, probably 800 or 900 people there. And I could see that this notion, they were starving for this notion of a corporate soul. Is there something that you can buy into or believe in that goes beyond the financial imperatives, beyond the self-motivated economic sides of things? What is the basis for it? And if you subscribe to the notion or the definition that a soul, if you just said, well, what's the definition of a soul? It's this spiritual part that's believed to give life to the body. It's believed to actually invigorate and give life to the body. Then a corporate soul could be argued is the spiritual part of an organization believed to give life to the overall corporate body or the corporation or the soul or body together, coming together to make it one. And I've really become fascinated with organizations that make that a high priority, that invest in their own corporate soul. I've worked with organizations that had it and lost it or abdicated it or gave it away. I've seen organizations that have taken something with decades. I worked for a company that was over 150 years old and had an opportunity for a capital event that just stripped it of its soul, even its own brand. It was subsumed and digested into another entity. And I watched a corporate soul completely disappear. And so over the years, I've been fascinated with the idea of, can a corporation have a soul? Should it have a soul? And if they lose their soul, what is it that's the loss there? I think over the years, the idea of corporate identity around mission, vision, and values, your noble purpose, your reason for being or existing, coupled with your long-term vision of what you hope to accomplish, and then basically underscored by your values. These are the things this is the way you want to show up in service of your noble purpose or mission and your end game or your vision. But I think those have become pleasantries or even platitudes in corporate America and throughout the world, where organizations believe they need to have them, almost like they check a box, but may not metabolize them. They don't come from a place of true corporate soul that says this is who we are and who we want to be. And I need to be careful here. I need to actually start by suggesting that I don't think you can almost become too idealistic on this so as to be an easy target for people to say, oh, you're a hypocrite, you're not living that corporate soul. I've always said that your values and your whole notion of corporate soul should be a mirror more than a sword, right? It should be something you're looking at to reflect inward on yourself, whether you're an individual contributor to an organization, you're a manager, a senior manager or director level, or even vice president and C-suite officer. I think the idea of your core values as an enterprise as a part of, I don't believe it's entirely representative of, but it's a part of your own corporate soul is something that deserves to be looked at carefully, but mostly looked at as a reflection of yourself. In other words, does it align with who you are and what you believe, and are you nurturing it carefully inside of a larger environment? And I think sometimes when you set out to say, you know, our core values are humanity or sustainability or growth or these different beautiful concepts that are rich and meaningful, and then you might have your least impressive moment where you don't necessarily live that corporate soul perfectly. I think you're easily set up as a target. And I think we live in a world where we can be quick to judge or assess whether someone is being true to an ideal that they may want to profess or proclaim. I come from a perspective that says I'd much rather continue to teach it. I had a great friend once say to me, if it's true, you can teach it. And I think the elements of corporate soul that are principle-based, that is to say their truth, you can teach those things emphatically and confidently, knowing that you may be struggling yourself to be true to them. And so the idea of a corporate soul is something that I'm excited to unpack further in this whole podcast series. And we aim to look at it from different angles. Most of those angles come from some of my own natural experiences over the years in different roles. But we definitely want to look at just the idea of ethos. And I want to talk about that for a minute as an extension of, or kind of a sister to, the idea of corporate soul. If you study civilizations, if you are interested in anthropology or sociology, it's not uncommon for someone that's kind of zoomed in and studied a given group of people or a culture, for them to come away and call out the ethos of a given culture. Over the years, I've used the example, for example, in Polynesian islands, the Hawaiian Islands, for example, their ethos can be summed up with the single word of aloha, which I always used to think meant hello or goodbye, right? You arrive at a hotel in Hawaii, if you're traveling there, and you tend to say aloha, they say it back, and then they put a beautiful lei, a flower lei on you, and welcome you to the island. I learned from a dear friend of mine by the name of Rich Pinto. Rich was a manager that worked for me in Hawaii. He was from Hawaii, a Kamehameha graduate there on the island of Oahu, and he was teaching me what aloha really meant. And aloha meant love, and the aloha spirit was something that was much bigger than a hello or a salutation of goodbye. It was really the essence of love. And so if you said, what's the ethos of the Polynesian, in this case the Hawaiian culture, I might argue, well, it's aloha or it's love. It's interesting, he and I went one time. He was a professional boogie boarder, and when he worked for me, he would always line up some sort of unique Hawaiian experience when I'd always go out to see him there. And one time, Rich, I remember distinctly, took me out to boogie board, thinking unwisely that I could handle the waves in Hawaii, and I just got absolutely crushed, like in a washing machine, destroyed. And Rich did really, really well. Of course, he was a professional and made his way out, but he was wearing a set of Churchill fins. There's a couple $100, as I recall, and we were walking back to his vehicle, and there was a guy rummaging in the back of his truck to try to find his Churchill fins, and the surf was good. And I'll never forget, Rich saw this guy looking around in the back of his truck for his fins. He had a boogie board under his arm, and Rich just went over and said, "Here, bro, take my fins." And we got in the car. The guy was like, he threw him a shaka and said aloha, and that was it. So here's this guy that I had never seen before running out to drop his fins on and get in the water. And we're in the car, and I looked over at my buddy Rich, and I said, "Rich, do you know that guy?" And he goes, "No, I don't know him at all." And I said, "Well, you just gave him like $250 worth of fins. Are you going to get him back?" And he looked at me. He's like, "Bro, I got a pair at the house. It's aloha." And that started a conversation where he told me, like, aloha is that what you give out comes back to you. And I've never forgotten that. So the reason I want to talk about ethos, this notion is ethos is the defining or distinguishing spirit of a given culture. If the culture is a set of beliefs or behaviors or characteristics that then cascade from one generation down to the next, then this notion of ethos, which I think is really closely aligned with the corporate soul concept I want to share on these podcasts, the concept of ethos then is this defining unique spirit that makes you who you are. In America, although you could argue it's somewhat being lost, the American dream has always been the American ethos. This notion of if I work really, really hard if I'm willing to put in energy and effort and time, that opportunity should be afforded me here and I can reach the American dream. That's been for a long time the prevailing ethos of the United States of America. Again, I know it can be argued one way or the other, but that's kind of the concept of studying a given culture with an aim to determine, okay, what is their ethos or who are they? So now transition that into corporate America or a corporation as a whole. Think about how corporations get started and what it is exactly that happens there. And I think you'll be interested to note that corporations on the whole end up having a soul of their own. And it can be born of something intentional. It can morph and evolve over time in its own way. But I have seen companies that develop their own ethos. And in the businesses I'm associated with and have been over the years, I've felt more and more that it was really important to be both declarative about and really intentional and deliberate and strategic about what it is that you want to establish as your corporate soul, or in other words, your corporate ethos, the ethos or essence of your entity. And I'm excited in these podcasts. I intend to unpack this a little bit more and get into it in a hope to not only share a little window into the way my mind thinks and the way I like to run a business and try to influence a business, but also how it might inform and inspire you in your own business. Might give you a window into some areas that you can both improve on or expand on, and certainly hope it inspires you to give some thought to what it is that corporate soul might mean for you. I think there's this natural tendency in a capitalistic environment and economy that over time, the financial imperatives become the ethos. And I think that's a hallmark of a soul being lost in a corporate setting. If the financial imperatives become the primary motivating factors, if those financial objectives are the only thing, I think you'll end up making choices that violate the corporate soul and essence or ethos of your organization over time. And frankly, probably put you in a position where you're less differentiated, right? And while you may be arguably more sustainable or viable economically long term, I really do believe that if that becomes the only motivation, if that's the only governing principle, which is to maximize shareholder value in the form of economics, which we all know, like publicly traded companies, large corporations with institutional investors behind them, even closely held companies, sometimes will only define success in those financial terms. But it's been my experience, and I've had a fair amount of it, that if a company or an organization won't take the time to really audit, articulate, and be clear about what is their corporate soul, what is the corporate ethos, that distinguishing and differentiating spirit that then defines them and becomes that guiding light, inclusive of your core values as an enterprise, but not exclusive of other things. It can include a whole bunch of teachings and truths and motivations that really combine to be the essence of why something started, why it still moves forward and grows, and why it still inspires you for your very best efforts to be a part of it. And so a big part of this podcast series is dedicated to the idea of corporate soul. In addition to that, I've got a lot of experience in strategy formulation and even inspiring and informing execution, of that strategy. And so my dad, having been a head of strategy at Kraft Foods globally, reporting to the then CEO, Jim Kiltz, who's a good friend of my dad's, I hope to share some of the things that he's downloaded to me in various podcasts we'll be doing throughout these series that kind of aim more towards how do you zoom in and get clarity around strategy? How do you align an organization around key strategic focal points? How does strategy inform execution and find expression operationally downstream in execution? And I'm fortunate enough to have been raised in a home where my dad wasn't a professional baseball player that taught me how to play baseball or for that matter, any sport, but he was definitely a professional strategist. And being the youngest of four growing up in that home, I had a lot of unique opportunities to not necessarily play catch in the backyard per se, but to volley with him about notions of corporate alignment and strategic clarity that have really played a role in how I've developed over the years. And I get really, really animated and excited about sharing it with other people. On that strategy note, as part of Corporate Soul, I've taught that around the world to literally thousands and thousands of businesses along the way. And I really do feel that it's been a huge add in my life, and I get excited about sharing it with you on these podcasts. Other areas of focus that we'll be sharing here include discussing at length the idea of influence. Where does influence come from? How is it engendered? And I'm really going to spend time unbundling influence, both for the idea of selling with influence, but also impacting people favorably and kind of being an inflection point in the people that in their lives, the people that you lead. And we'll be spending more time discussing influence as well. And then I've spent a good proportion of my career also working closely with entrepreneurism. And so there will be elements of these podcasts that will also touch on entrepreneurism and what it is that really drives and guides the entrepreneurial spirit, and hopefully share some insights about ways that you can think about who you are and kind of clarify your identity as an entrepreneur. So by way of summary, heavy emphasis will be placed on this concept of corporate soul, hence the website and the whole podcast series really being tied to that notion of corporate soul. And then we'll be weaving in and braiding in over time sections about strategy and execution, how to get to strategic clarity. I'll be sharing on some of these podcasts very valuable exercises that I've learned from my dad, who was a Fortune 50 strategist. Really cool steps that I've used in my professional career, both in large corporate settings as well as entrepreneurial settings, that I've found to be bankable. These are things that you can really take advantage into the bank. And so there's some of the series, the podcast series, will zoom in on those exercises, as well as kind of sharing with you the comprehensive whole of how my dad used to get to strategic clarity. We'll be zooming in on influence, as I mentioned, as it relates to selling. And I like to think about selling more from the perspective or through the lens of influence. How do I promote and inspire a response in somebody else that's actually meaningful and positive, rather than maybe trying to convince somebody or manipulate someone to want to buy something? And I think that's a unique skill set that's born way more of the principles that underscore influence than necessarily your ability to talk about feature or benefit of a product. So we'll be spending time hitting on some of that as well. And then, as I mentioned, I'll be zooming in on entrepreneurism as a really fun and key interest area for me, something I've done a lot of work with and had the blessing and fortunate reality of working with some of the best entrepreneurs in the country. And I'll certainly be talking about some of them and the things that I've learned from them. So I'm excited that you're here listening. I hope that these coming series and podcasts will be additive and helpful to you. I'm certain down the line we may have guest speakers that will join us that we can involve in this. But I would challenge you to give some thought to corporate soul as kind of the overarching theme of what it is we'll be talking about here. If you're listening to this as an entrepreneur starting your own small home-based business, all the way up to running existing businesses, there is this question of what is your corporate soul? How well can you articulate it? How does it find expression? How do you punctuate it with your staff, your employees, or your own self if you're a sole proprietor? And as you look for partnerships that you want to work with inside of your own ecosystems, how do you find out if their corporate soul is a match with yours? What is it that you're looking for? And I'm excited to launch this podcast series with all of you guys. And again, thank you for taking some time to listen. And I hope this early podcast, this first pass, is just a way that I can share some of this corporate ethos and soul with you guys. But more than anything, just frame up what we intend to do on this podcast series. So thanks for joining, and I look forward to sharing various sessions with you guys. Hopefully I can keep you with us. I always joke and say, if nothing else, maybe if you can't get to sleep, you can fire one of these up, and it'll help you get to sleep. But hopefully it'll be something you can claim has been additive and helpful as you've continued to explore your full potential. So look forward to it, and really thank you for joining us on this first kind of orientation podcast. Thanks so much.